viewing was used by my research team to break a really difficult issue that was haunting us in our Planet X research years back. And it was back in about 2005. And at that time, you know, what people were doing was, it was the old whip out the calendar time. Okay, Nibiru is in a 3,600-year orbit, blah, 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 blah. It should be here on, you know, boom, and they're pointing to calendars. Well, that wasn't working. But all of us as researchers, you have to answer that. Why is it that we're not having this absolute, you know, it's not running like a Mussolini train schedule?
Yeah.
So I had a friend of mine who is a researcher, does remote viewing instruction in Japan. He's an expat, Eihan Derove. And the Japanese love him. This guy gets up in an audience, you know, in an auditorium, and he's wearing a kilt and speaking perfect Japanese. You know, they just eat him up.
Yeah.
And one of the things he does is he does remote viewing classes. And the Japanese love this stuff. They're doing it like crazy. And we were talking about remote viewing, and I just said, you know, out of curiosity, I sure would, you know, we're trying to resolve this periodicity issue of 3,600 years, 3,600 years, 3,600 years, and it's not working out exactly right on the timing. You know, see what you can do with your next group. And he had like about 19 people. He was graduating the following week out of his class. And so for the final exam, it was Nibiru, Planet X. Well, the results that we got back, 4 of them, zip, nothing. They couldn't see anything. And the rest of them saw something, and it was all, they were all making pictures of stars. That was it. They were just drawing stars, kind of like the star that, you know, when you were in 2nd grade and the teacher would slap it on your report card, you, woo,
yeah.
I got the gold star.
Yeah.
That's what they were doing. But one guy drew a picture of what he saw, and it was completely befuddling. It was totally stood out. It looked like a funnel cone, the kind that, you know, when water's circling the drain, it goes down, and it's got that whirling pattern, you know, slowly working its way down into nothing. And he sent me that, and I looked at it, and I, for the life of me, could not figure out what it was. But I had a gut instinct that I'm saying, you know, with a mystery like this, you just put it in a clear jar, set it on the shelf, and wait for the universe to fax you a label.
Yeah.
And synchronicity. Well, sure enough, about 6 months later, we're sitting there and having these going back conversations with Andy Lloyd, who wrote Dark Star. And also he wrote a nice review for our book, Planet X Forecast. And Andy was struggling with the very same concept. And then he was talking about something called the Kozai mechanism, and he just mentioned it in conversation. And then Kozai mechanism, we looked it up. Boom. It explained everything. It explained that one odd symbol in the remote viewing that the guy saw, because what the Kozai mechanism explains is that an object that is in a sharply inclined orbit, all right, when we are thinking about Planet X being on a calendar, Planet X is going around the sun just like the Earth and Venus and Mars. You know, we're all in this nice little orbit that's on or very close to the ecliptic, the plane of our solar system. But you have ones that are kind of steeply inclined. The most inclined is Pluto. It's a minor planet. But that's nowhere near inclined as to what Planet X is. And we knew it was coming up from the south. And what the Kozai mechanism is, it was created by Yoshida Kozai in 1962, a Japanese astronomer, to explain how different objects perturb each other's orbits. And what the Kozai mechanism says is that if you are orbiting around the ecliptic, it's nice and stable. But if you are at an angle to the ecliptic, steep angle to the ecliptic, your orbit deteriorates, and visually it looks like water circling the drain. Because Kozai mechanism says one of two things will happen in that kind of an orbital alignment. Either the smaller object is hurled out into deep space to become a rogue, or it's going to death spiral into the object it's orbiting, which means there's a continually changing periodicity in the orbit because you have a deteriorating orbit. And once we applied the Kozai mechanism to all of this, that was it. The dime dropped, everything connected. all the patterns fit. We could understand exactly what was happening. But it started with a remote viewer who made an oddball illustration that we couldn't figure out at the time.
Yeah.
So
now,
I'm sold on RV.
Yeah. Well, you know, Marshall, that's actually pretty interesting. A lot of times things do happen with that type of remote viewing. However, that type of remote viewing, I've seen things like that happen before. It's lucky because the type of remote viewing that I'm involved with, I'm the director of the Far Sight Institute, and just so your listeners know, it's www.farsight, like seeing far, FARSIGHT.org, and we're the leading science shop anywhere that has full-blown science studies of using remote viewing to investigate these major projects that is fully accessible by the public. All the sessions are available, explanatory videos, everything is there. And we use people typically that are not rapidly trained like the type you're talking about, but people who have been working with these procedures that were developed by the United States military and used for espionage purposes, or procedures that are derivative of those methodologies. And typically these people I work with have been working with these procedures intensively for a period of a decade or more. And so it's like playing the piano. If you go to the piano, anyone can bang it out and make noise, and occasionally someone will make some interesting noise. But if you want to regularly be able to say, I'm a concert pianist, and be like Lang Lang and show up in Carnegie Hall, it takes years and practice and all that stuff. So the types of remote viewers that I work with don't produce like these symbols, which I have seen. I know what you're talking about, that you have to spend a long time sort of figuring out. But really, you have the credit has to go to you to be able to figure stuff like that. The type of stuff that we work with, the reviewers that we work with, they're trained to give absolutely unambiguous, very clear data, so that the pictures are clear, the writing, the verbal descriptions are clear. There's no ambiguity at all with regard to what they're actually portraying. So that's a sort of light years different from people who are newly trained and do have some information that come out, and you have to sort of scratch your head for years trying to figure it out and figure out some type of a symbol that's being used. So these types of information with these types of people are easier for the masses to understand and grasp when you have really explicit data with really clear sketches, and people who are not really familiar with remote viewing can simply look at it and say, oh, yes, I see, so that's what that is. The interpretation issue becomes much more easy. So I do understand that. The issue about the Planet X thing, I've actually been sort of interested in that since your first book, the 2012 book. And that it's really not in dispute in astronomical circles anymore that we do live in a binary star system. The binary star systems are the most common in the galaxy, so most stars have other stars orbiting them. So it's not unusual to have a binary star system. And a brown dwarf of the type you're talking about is actually a very stable configuration. Our sun, which is a bright sun, will last about 10 billion years. A brown dwarf will last about 100 billion years. And in fact, it could sustain life as long as the planets that surround it are closer to it than we are to our sun. And astronomers, mainstream astronomers, you can actually Google this and find a whole bunch of articles about this. Mainstream astronomers are pretty much, the big ones, are pretty much agreed that there is a brown dwarf in our solar system. The only thing is that they're talking now, the big people who are looking for it, are talking now about saying that they're on the hunt for it, and they're predicting they'll be able to find it in about a year, year and a half, 2 years, and they'll make an announcement. That's where I lose credibility. That's where I drop the issue of credibility, because that's so stupid. For them to be able, for them to have all of these telescopes, all of this fancy equipment, and then to tell us that they can't find a blankety-blank star in our own solar system is just so stupid. They know damn well where it is. The question is they're not telling us where it is for whatever reason. Now, this is not to say that that the star, they're saying it stays way out there. And this is not to say that it dips in or into the inner realms of the solar system or stays out. The issue for me personally is the idea that they don't know where it is, given the billions of dollars that have been spent on their equipment, is just absolutely ridiculous. Okay, maybe they can hunt for a meteor, but you can't tell me they don't know where a whole blankety-blank star is in our own solar system.
That's
all
right.
You need is an infrared. All you need is an infrared telescope, and you can find it. So it's just not credible to me. So, but the question then turns out to, does it dip into our inner solar system, and is it coming anytime soon? So, that's a very reasonable thing. And it is also very reasonable to assume that mainstream scientists would not say that it dips into our inner solar system if they found out it does. You wouldn't expect them to say, oh, by the way, it does dip into our inner solar system. So the idea that you've been raising for a long time, that they would announce that only when it was so obvious and inevitable that you could basically see it, is actually correct. That's exactly what they would do. And so the issue is now whether this Nibiru whatever is coming anytime soon, like within the next 12 months or something like that. And I simply do not know. I simply do not know. The issue is that we conducted what I called a climate study. Initially, I was not a fan of the Mayan calendar or the Nibiru thing or anything. I actually thought the Mayan calendar thing was the stupidest thing I ever heard in my life. The idea that Mayan priests could have figured out the end of the world or anything related to something that would happen in 2012 was so ridiculous I just laughed at it. So when I started this climate project, by the way, I don't laugh anymore. But when I started this climate project, I was initially creating it with the idea of a test to see if remote viewing could be used to detect small things like climate change over a span of, say, 5 years. So it was between June 1st, 2008 and June 1st, 2013. That was the span. That was the time period we were looking for. And we had targets that the remote viewers, and again, these are the best remote viewers on the planet. We had targets that were picked for all over the planet. Actually, most of them were. There's a problem with that. We weren't looking for these big things. So we were looking for. Most of the targets were ecologically fragile places that we might see maybe a few more storms, or maybe an inch rise in the sea level, or maybe a little less snow on the top of Mount Kilimanjaro. So most of the places were coastal places, like by Tuvalu, an island that's like 1 foot above sea level in the Pacific. And then Fort Jesus, Mombasa, a Portuguese fort on the Indian Ocean coast of East Africa, and Sydney Opera House in Sydney, Australia, with that unique architecture. Mount Kilimanjaro, which is actually not far from the coast, and Tanzania. United States Congress Building, which is right on the coast and only 90 feet above sea level, and the Malay International Airport, which is in the Maldives. KITV Building, that's a TV building in Honolulu, Hawaii. One of our planetary great remote viewers, Dick Algier, is a celebrity newscaster there. And Key West, Florida, and also the Vehicle Assembly Building, Launch Complex 9, Kennedy Space Center, Merritt Island, Florida. So those are the targets that we were looking at. And we looked at June 1st, 2008, and June 1st, 2013. And then I devised this, what I was so proud was the most ingenious randomization process that you may ask me about later, and I'll describe it if you want.
No, I want to get in. Courtney, the thing is the more I studied what you're doing, first off, I came to this awareness exactly the same way you did. We were both trying to figure out Earth changes or global warming, and we walked straight backwards into it. Okay.
Yeah, it was really surprising. In fact, when we got the results back, I started studying them, looking for that small changes. And what we got back were these humongous things that I couldn't believe. My eyes popped out. I said, this can't be. This is ridiculous. And so, now we're in it. But actually, but Marshall, let me say, from a scientific perspective, it turned out to be a really great thing, because if you're looking at small things, it's hard to find them in remote viewing data. It's actually hard to discern them. But if you actually find something really big, it becomes a perfect scientific experiment. So by June 1st, 2013, which is not long from now, we get to see, I have a theory associated with this, there's a lot of interesting stuff associated with it, that if any of these Earth changes happen between now and June 1st, 2013, I will be able to state that that the theory was correct. But anyway, at this point, I have to say the following. Your idea about this Planet X thing is a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. There may be other reasons for these Earth changes. I can't weigh in on the cause of the Earth changes, but I do see these data, and they're absolutely unambiguous. They're talking about the same types of things that you have been talking about in your 2012. What is the book called again? Your 2012 Survival Guide.
Planet X, like 2012, Planet X and Survival Guide, 2012.
Yeah,
Planet
so
X.
I can't, unfortunately, there's a couple problems with the study. We were looking for small things, so we really didn't gear it up to look for, like, the cause of what these things were, because I didn't expect there to be a cause. I expected there just to be some storms and little sea rises and sea level rises. So we don't have any data on the cause. So I can't state that. And the other problem is, that we were looking at ecologically fragile areas, which is mostly coastal stuff. So I have absolutely no data on inland areas. However, I nonetheless can say that these are the only hard data that exist that describe that future, and given this theory that I hopefully will have a chance to explain tonight. And they are the only hard data that were collected under absolutely pristine conditions of more than triple blind, once you realize the randomization process that was used. And we're using the best remote viewers on the planet Earth. And in fact, the results are so clearly binary, meaning it's an on-off thing. It's not at all foggy, fuzzy, close. You don't have to interpret a lot. It's just interface stuff. So it's a really great scientific experiment. Whether the results happen or they don't happen, from the perspective of science, it's a perfect solution. If it's a perfect experiment, however, let's get to this a little bit later, but let me just I'll stop now, but let me just say one last thing. Marshall, if these results turn out to be true, then the issue of this dance of denial within the mainstream scientific community with respect to the reality of the remote viewing phenomenon is over in a few months. It's done. It's over. It's gone. Yes. And so, because I've been on the radio all over the place, you're now watching this stuff, people are learning about what we've done and how many years of research we put into this. They know how much science is involved in this. And we also have, I was just at the University of Boulder, University of Colorado at Boulder this summer, and at Boulder, Colorado at the Society for Scientific Exploration, I gave a detailed presentation of the science of why remote viewing works and why, you know, the basic classical theories of classical physics and relativistic physics are not complete, which is, and what actually the remote viewing phenomenon tells us about the nature of reality. And that was recorded, and it's up on our website, which is www.farsight.org, and it's on our homepage, and you can just watch that presentation I gave in this summer. So we now understand the science of it, we understand the reality of it, and if these results happen, then we will also have confirmation that will be worldwide, planetarily recognized. Marshall, that's the problem. You say that, well, that's great, Courtney, that's good. But Marshall, no, that's the problem. If mainstream science continues to ignore or deny the reality of remote viewing to the end, and if these results actually hold up, what happens in times of significant public challenges? What happened, for example, during the French Revolution? And in the late 1700s, what you get is chaos. And what happens then? They were chopping off the aristocratic head, the aristocrats' heads like they were popcorn in a movie. What you get is you get anarchy, and the masses in the reign of terror turned away from everybody. So if mainstream science continues to ignore or deny the reality of remote viewing, what you have is that the masses, well, we know that they're going to say the government was lying to us, but they always have known that, not our government, but all governments. But my fear is that they'll also do the same thing to mainstream science, because it's very clear that the governments are preparing, and the masses will then say that many mainstream scientists were in on this from the beginning, and in order to help the government do what they did. And we run the risk of the masses turning away from not only governmental leadership, but the scientific leadership as well. And if that happens, we enter the possibility of marching into the future without the guidance of reason. Now, I'm a scientist. I don't want that to happen. I want the future to be built to be better than ever, to be a galactic representation of what is possible. But if the masses in their hysteria turn away from not only governmental leadership, but also scientific leadership, we run into that problem. So we will simply know by June 1st, 2013, if these results don't happen, what have we lost? Well, okay, my reputation may be a little bit dinged, maybe a lot dinged, and I'll go back to the drawing board to try to figure out how these results could have possibly turned out. But if these results do happen, which I think will be, based on my theory that I've developed, then the issue of whether remote viewing is real or not is over. And then we're facing a situation in which, how do we control the masses? Now, people have said to me, but Courtney, though people will know that you were telling the truth, so they'll listen to you. Marshall, that's the stupidest idea, because what is one single little voice against, who would have listened to anybody during the French Revolution? They were chopping off everybody's heads.
But it's worse than that. It's worse than that. Let me tell you this. I mean, this was years ago. This is about 10 years, 11 years ago. I gave my first presentation on Earth changes. It was a packed auditorium, and it was a big event, and the first talk I gave was so powerful that the people begged me to come back the second day and to continue with another hour. And so I go back, and I finished talking about all of the stuff that we were seeing happening in this time, which is happening in this time. And in the middle of my presentation, I had a woman bolt up, point a finger at me in front of the whole audience and say, "You are the Antichrist. You are manifesting this. You are evil."
That's the example of what I'm talking about. That's the type of thing where superstition and fear and paranoia take over instead of scientific reason. So it's in the interest of mainstream science to at least acknowledge the reality of remote viewing. Well, sooner is better than later, because at least then people will say, oh, well, you were telling us the truth then. Let's march forward in the future and rebuild and do nice things. And again, these things may not happen, but if they do happen, it's better to have scientific, because the reality of remote viewing is real. So it's better, since it's going to be acknowledged eventually, it's better that it happens sooner rather than later if these things are going to happen.
Well, Courtney, I think tonight we can give you some new hope with this, because things I'm seeing, and so are Alfred, and actually the reason why this interview came together tonight. But first I want to say, as one person who's look, we're science guys, let's just call ourselves what we are. We're a couple of geeks, okay? And we're geeks, and as one geek to another, having researched your methodology, I have the most profound respect for your work, and here is why. You really come at this, you are purely agnostic and objective in how you come at your studies. I'm not seeing agenda-driven stuff. And I mean, like, for example, the guy, I think Cliff High, WebBot Project, he was on the show. And I was in the computer industry for 23 years. And I did consulting contracts with Oracle, Sun Microsystems, Hewlett-Packard, Lockheed Martin, AT&T, and so on. And one of my specialties was database management and database mining. Now, database management is what folks do with, that's reconciling your checkbook. Database management is that you're looking for different relationships in the data that you've never seen or even imagined before. And to me, remote viewing is very much like database mining, is that you are looking for relationships and things that we've never seen before, what you have discovered. And that was the principal thing I had in terms of looking at the WebBot project. As a technologist, I could see that they are deeply flawed because they have agendas, and they're agenda-driven when they're going out and doing setting up their parameters. There are things that they just have hot buttons about. And so consequently, that's what they favor in the data. So the positive and negative timelines was really more like a 55-45, right?
Well, actually, it's like this. First of all, we have 3 places. We have not geographical places, but we have those 9 geographical places. But the sense is we have June 1st, 2008. And even, this is something we're probably not going to get into tonight, but we have done a year-long study that was published recently, a few months ago, in a leading peer-reviewed journal, the Journal for Scientific Exploration, on our Multiple Universe project. Now, Multiple Universe project, it was a 1-year-long project exploring the idea that has been around since Hugh Everett published his dissertation in 1957, and that was that there are multiple realities, parallel realities, realities where we're still talking here but wearing different color shirts, things like that, or realities where this interview is not happening, or a reality in which all the major wars of the 20th century did not happen, another reality in which World War II ended with nuclear destruction, things like that. So, in fact, that year-long project was affirmative. And by the way, if people want to see the data and the experiment and the design of the experiment, you can go to our website, farsight.org. Remember, we're a nonprofit. And you can, on the home page, you'll see a little brown, actually it's a big brown banner, saying latest peer-reviewed published research. And if you click on that, you'll get a free copy of the work. However, the idea being is that we were already, when we were doing this study, I was already becoming convinced that remote viewing was working as if there were multiple realities, parallel realities. So this study was designed to explore 2 parallel futures. Now, the idea is that if there are parallel realities, it's very easy to remote view the past. If you want to remote view the sinking of the Titanic, again, that's the tasking structure that's doing that, not the remote viewers. The remote viewers never know anything about the target. It's got to be totally, totally, totally blind when the remote viewers do the work. They can't know anything about the target. They have to know nothing. But the tasker, or the person who's designing the study, says, okay, I'm going to have these remote viewers go to see the sinking of the Titanic. So in the tasker's mind, there's a very clear idea of what she or he wants the remote viewers to perceive, so they get the sinking of the Titanic. But in the future, if you're looking in the future, you don't know the future because it hasn't happened yet, so you don't have a time stream to look at it, so you don't know what future you want. So remote viewing the future has always been more problematic than remote viewing anything in the present or remote viewing anything in the past. So what we did here is I said, okay, if we cannot remote view the future in a deterministic way, because at every point of the now there's a branching off into different timelines, well, what I can do is say, well, let's look at a timeline in which A, B, and C happens, and let's look at another timeline in which X, Y, and Z happens. Now, neither of those will be our timelines, but we can look at two futures. And then we can say, well, then what is our timeline like? Is it like more A, B, and C, or X, Y, and Z? So we have two timelines that we looked at for June 1st, 2013. So if we have 9 targets and two timelines for 2013, that's 3 different places. So we have 9 times 3, so we have essentially 27 targets. So the 2 timelines are, for the 2013 June 1st targets, it's the timeline, we'll call this timeline A, the timeline in which the leadership of the mainstream scientific community continues to ignore or deny the reality of remote viewing and the existence of life not originating from Earth. That can be any life, even microbial life. The idea was that if the original idea was that if the mainstream scientific community did acknowledge the reality of remote viewing, planetary attention would be focused on our results, the remote viewing results, and the populace, the whole planet, would start behaving towards the planet perhaps a little differently, and we might be able to pick that up with respect to climate change. That was the idea. Remember, we weren't searching for big changes. We were looking for something small.
That's
anyway,
right.
the second
Bite
timeline,
size.
call it timeline B, that was June 1st, 2013. But following the timeline in which by the end of 2009, now that already happened, so it's not our timeline, leaders of the mainstream global scientific establishment publicly recognize the reality of the remote viewing phenomenon and the existence of life not originating from Earth. So now let us say we go and another couple months goes on and there's a major announcement saying remote viewing is real. Okay? Well, then we would be more like timeline B, even though timeline B says it's, the end of 2009. Nonetheless, the very fact that it happens at all makes us more like timeline B than timeline A, in which the mainstream global scientific community continues permanently just to ignore or deny right past June 1st, 2013. So that way we can look at our timeline and sort of compare it to those 2 timelines. So, but what we got in terms of results was, in terms of absolute, again, we were looking for small changes. What we found in terms of the 2008 data, and this is so interesting, once you realize and once you listen to the randomization process, that was absolutely perfect. It was so squeaky clean, nobody on the planet Earth could have known when a remote viewer was doing a session, A, they didn't know the targets, but B, they had absolutely no way of knowing if they were doing a 2008 or a 2013 session because of the randomization process that was used. When you hear how I did it, you'll just be blown away. It was very clever, to be quite honest. Anyway, when
well,
they
lay
did
it on me. Lay it on me.
Well,
I want to
I'll
hear
do
it.
But let me give the results first.
Okay.
When they came in with the results, there was essentially no disaster content for the 2008 sessions. That means the tourists were still going. The Opera House in Sydney was still giving operas. The Washington, D.C. was still passing bills. Do you get the idea? Everything was normal. And the 2008 time has already passed, and in fact, that's exactly what did happen in 2008. So those data described June 1st, 2008. Remember, the sessions themselves were done before June 1st. They were done in the first half. And so, and we did a process of public verification of the data. So it's not such a situation where people have to trust me. I'll explain later in the show how the scientific experiment was set up. And then once you realize it, you'll say, oh my gee, because this is, it's not something where you have to trust anybody. I used to live in Missouri, and the idea of show me state, don't trust anybody, should be applied to science at all times. So, but when we got the 2013 results, well, I was looking for small change. What we got was these humongous changes. But now the percentages is what you're asking about. In timeline A, which is where the scientific global establishment continues to ignore or deny the reality of remote viewing, we got over 50% of the sessions describing total wipeout disasters. It was for those tough places. Now, for timeline B, it was a little better. It was a little less than 50%, but on average, we're talking around 50%, talking still wipeout disasters. The difference between timeline A and timeline B seems to be that in timeline B, there was more people, and they seemed to be self-cooperating among themselves a little more. I mean, significantly more. And in timeline A, we don't see that as much. So from that perspective, it looked a little better. But it doesn't say that the events that triggered the Earth changes didn't happen. What did change was apparently people's interaction with those Earth changes happened. And it seemed to have improved things. See, the scoring was a little better if there's a lot of people working together. And it's a little worse if you see no people and they're all, and everything's sort of washed away. And, you know, so when you see any type of cooperation, it's a little better. Anyway, so that was the basic idea. Now, this leads to the question is there another timeline in which, say, 45% of the sessions don't describe disasters? That's the misunderstanding that's going around.
Okay.
With remote viewing, if remote viewers don't see something, that doesn't mean the opposite is there. Maybe I should repeat that sentence. If remote viewers don't see something, that does not mean the opposite is there. Meaning, if somebody doesn't see something, you can't say it's not there. It's like this. Marshall, if I were to ask you to go into a room and say, report back to me what's there, and you go into a room and you say, oh, it looks like a bedroom, okay? There's a bed, I see a closet, 2 pictures on the wall, a bookshelf, and a window, okay? And you come out and you report back to me and you say, well, you saw a bed, closet, 2 pictures on the wall, and a window. And then, now, could I then say, okay, then I will absolutely be certain that there's no shoes in the corner? Well, you couldn't say that. There may damn well be shoes in the corner. You just didn't see them or didn't notice it.
You didn't notice it, right? You didn't observe it.
Yeah, so when remote viewers go at a target, they see what they see, and what they don't see, they simply don't see. Now, there's 2 things that happen here. If remote viewers go into a target and don't report back that there are people, that doesn't mean that there are no people there. That means that they didn't report people. However, if they report back that, well, hey, there's no people here, where did the people go? That's an observation. That's a difference. Does that make sense? So if they simply don't report people and just never mention people, you cannot assume that there are no people. But if they come back and say, oh, hey, there's no people there, that's a direct observation, and that is saying that the data are saying that there are no people there. So we have some situations like that. Now, with regard to those sessions, say 45% of the sessions that don't report any sort of what you might call disaster content, that does not mean that those sessions are actively reporting that everything is peachy clean. It's just saying that they're not being explicit with respect to whether there's disaster. They may be reporting a coastline. They may be reporting sand. They may be reporting some water. So they may get a good score for the fact that they've described an island, okay? But they're not saying in none of those sessions, or essentially none of those sessions there might be one, but essentially there's very few or almost none of those sessions that do not report disaster content. None of them actually say, with the possible exception of one that I'm thinking, actually say things are peachy clean, this is nice. Do you get the idea? So this reminds me, for my listeners, years ago, many years ago, and I started off in all this, I had a wonderful chance to have several conversations with Dr. Brian Marsden. Then he's passed away now, but at the time, at the Smithsonian Astrophysics, he was the guy that if you found an object, he was the go-to guy to get it named in the catalog. Yeah, okay.
And one of the things he told me that I thought was really brilliant, because we were talking about, for example, people that go, there's nothing out there. We know everything, nothing's out there, and they have absolute certainty. His observation to me was, he said, Marshall, the failure to observe an object proves only one thing. You have failed to observe the object. Exactly.
That's exactly right. Exactly right.
Yeah, and so, your position on this is absolutely, it's spot on. And what viewing was used by my research team to break a really difficult issue that was haunting us in our Planet X research years back, and it was back in about 2005. And at that time, you know, what people were doing was, it was the old whip out the calendar time. Okay, Nibiru is in a 3,600-year orbit, blah, 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 blah. It should be here on, you know, boom, and they're pointing to calendars. Well, that wasn't working. But all of us as researchers, you have to answer that. Why is it that we're not having this absolute, you know, it's not running like a Mussolini train schedule?
Yeah.
So I had a friend of mine who is a researcher who does remote viewing instruction in Japan. He's an expat, Eihan Derove. And the Japanese love him. This guy gets up in an audience, you know, in an auditorium, and he's wearing a kilt and speaking perfect Japanese. You know, they just eat him up. And one of the things he does is he does remote viewing classes. And the Japanese love this stuff. They're doing it like crazy. And we were talking about remote viewing, and I just said, you know, out of curiosity, I sure would, you know, we're trying to resolve this periodicity issue of 3,600 years, 3,600 years, 3,600 years, and it's not working out exactly right on the timing. You know, see what you can do with your next group. And he had like about 19 people. He was graduating the following week out of his class. And so for the final exam, it was Nibiru, Planet X. Well, the results that we got back, 4 of them, zip, nothing. They couldn't see anything. And the rest of them saw something, and it was all, they were all making pictures of stars. That was it. They were just drawing stars, kind of like the star that, you know, when you were in 2nd grade and the teacher would slap it on your report card, you, woo,
yeah.
I got the gold star.
Yeah.
That's what they were doing. But one guy drew a picture of what he saw, and it was completely befuddling. It was totally stood out. It looked like a funnel cone, the kind that, you know, when water's circling the drain, it goes down, and it's got that whirling pattern, you know, slowly working its way down into nothing. And he sent me that, and I looked at it, and I, for the life of me, could not figure out what it was. But I had a gut instinct that I'm saying, you know, with a mystery like this, you just put it in a clear jar, set it on the shelf, and wait for the universe to fax you a label.
Yeah.
And synchronicity. Well, sure enough, about 6 months later, we're sitting there and having these going back conversations with Andy Lloyd, who wrote Dark Star. And also he wrote a nice review for our book, Planet X Forecast. And Andy was struggling with the very same concept. And then he was talking about something called the Kozai mechanism, and he just mentioned it in conversation. And then Kozai mechanism, we looked it up. Boom. It explained everything. It explained that one odd symbol in the remote viewing that the guy saw, because what the Kozai mechanism explains is that an object that is in a sharply inclined orbit, all right, when we are thinking about Planet X being on a calendar, Planet X is going around the sun just like the Earth and Venus and Mars. You know, we're all in this nice little orbit that's on or very close to the ecliptic, the plane of our solar system. But you have ones that are kind of steeply inclined. The most inclined is Pluto. It's a minor planet. But that's nowhere near inclined as to what Planet X is. And we knew it was coming up from the south. And what the Kozai mechanism is, it was created by Yoshida Kozai in 1962, a Japanese astronomer, to explain how different objects perturb each other's orbits. And what the Kozai mechanism says is that if you are orbiting around the ecliptic, it's nice and stable. But if you are at an angle to the ecliptic, steep angle to the ecliptic, your orbit deteriorates, and visually it looks like water circling the drain. Because Kozai mechanism says one of two things will happen in that kind of an orbital alignment. Either the smaller object is hurled out into deep space to become a rogue, or it's going to death spiral into the object it's orbiting, which means there's a continually changing periodicity in the orbit because you have a deteriorating orbit. And once we applied the Kozai mechanism to all of this, that was it. The dime dropped, everything connected, all the patterns fit. We could understand exactly what was happening. But it started with a remote viewer who made an oddball illustration that we couldn't